Welcome to another episode of the Looking After Nature podcast, where I hope to bring you close to nature and wildlife in Hampshire. My name is Andy Davidson, and I'm here once again with my co-host, Carly Harrod. Hi, Carly.
Hi, Andy. How are you today?
I'm fine, and it's good to be out once again, in the fresh air.
Of course, and especially because you're out with me today, Andy.
That's always special. Carly, you know that.
Yeah. So today's podcast is a little bit different, as we don't have a guest today.
No, we don't this month, and that's because you're talking to me.
Yes. So you've been with the service for a number of years now, and you've held a number of different roles, but you've recently taken on a new role. What's that?
Yeah, 30 years. I think I've said that before, so I've been around for quite a while. But I've just started a new role as the Nature Recovery Officer for the service and for the department as well, actually.
So what is nature recovery?
Well, that is quite a big question, actually, because it covers a lot of topics. It's a new thing that's sort of coming out. It's a new idea that's been building for some time. And it's understanding that the wildlife and nature in the general countryside across the world actually has declined so much through various things, and you've got climate change happening, and it's all interconnected. Mm-hmm. So there'll be something coming out soon called the Local Nature Recovery Strategies, which will cover the entirety of England. And that will be trying to work out how we can improve things for nature. But also it's the natural processes which happen in nature. Mm-hmm. Things like photosynthesis, which will sequester carbon, which will hope to reduce the impact of climate change. There's things like natural flood management, where natural habitats can hopefully reduce the impact of flooding and things like that. So it's a very, very big topic. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's going to be a bit difficult to express in one big question.
Why is it becoming so important now, though? Why is this so critical now? We've known about climate change for a long time. You know, why have we now changed over to this more of a nature recovery?
I think it's the recognition that the majority of people now recognise climate change as a thing. There's still some people who deny it's happening, or they just say it's natural. And actually, if you talk about the different periods of time, you know, if we're talking about the Paleolithic, we're talking about the Stone Age. And if you talk about dinosaurs, you know, they have their own periods. Mm-hmm. There's a thing now that people think about as the Anthropocene, which means it's the time where people have had the most impact on the world. Mm-hmm. So clearly, when we were running around as cavemen, you know,
some people still are.
Some people still are. They don't live in caves normally, no. But you know, so you're not having, you know, you're part of the environment. You're having less impact than, you know, we would be, you know, as people, modern day humans you might think of. You know, they're not driving around in cars, they're not using fossil fuels to heat their houses. But it's got past the point where, in some ways, the world can cope with all of that. Mm-hmm. So it's been recognised, actually, we need to, and climate change is happening. You know, we had those storms just a couple of weeks back. You know, it's 3 storms, all record breaking, some of them in terms of wind, but records only set a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. Flooding, you know, and that's all to do with the general heating of the environment of the world wide, which gives you more extremes. Mm-hmm. Now, the natural world is quite good at buffering all that. Yeah. You know, so it moderates things. So that, for example, trees, we know trees and plants produce oxygen in photosynthesis, and they absorb carbon, carbon dioxide. And that's good for us because, you know, we breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. Mm-hmm. And previously, the effect of the plants and animals would outweigh any impact we had in terms of our carbon emissions. So that the plants would have naturally moderated and reduced the impact of any carbon emissions. Now, carbon dioxide, which is given out partly when we breathe. Carbon dioxide is given out when we breathe, but it'll also be given out when things like trees, we're standing next to a wood pile here, so as they rot down, the carbon that's in that tree will be slowly released into the atmosphere. And if you burn it, it's released quicker. Mm-hmm. And then if you dig up fossil fuels like oil and coal and burn them, that gives out more carbon dioxide. Mm-hmm. Until the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is called a greenhouse gas. It's one of the greenhouse gases. And if you imagine you're in a greenhouse, it's warmer in the greenhouse, isn't it?
It is.
So it'll let heat through, but won't let it escape, basically. Yeah. So then the whole planet starts warming.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be just by a little bit. I think that they're trying to aim at the moment to keep the increase below 2 degrees. Because once you start getting over that point, you could eventually, if you just carry on like we have been, you reach the point of no return.
Yep.
Where you aren't able to do anything to stop that chain reaction. You know, and you're going to have to imagine things like, you know, Mars might have had an atmosphere at one point.
Might have.
But it's totally uninhabitable now.
Mm-hmm.
But we're just in that lovely, they call it the Goldilocks zone in a planet's positioning in its solar system. It's just right. It's not too hot, not too cold. You know, so it's able to have liquid water and it's able to retain its atmosphere. But if you let it balance too far, then that whole structure breaks down.
So it is really important. We only have one world. As you said, we don't have other ones we can go zooming off to live. So we need to take care of what we have, don't we?
Absolutely. And I mean, I've heard one illustration of how, because you look up at the sky and you think, well, it's limitless, isn't it? You know, there's this lovely sky up there full of clouds today.
Yeah, full of clouds today, but it's still lovely.
Yeah. Well, if you think about the sort of globe you might have had, you know, those illustrations of the world on a globe in your science, you know, your science lab at school or stuff like that. Do you know how thick in relation, if it's at the same scale, the atmosphere is to that globe?
No.
It's a sheet of paper.
Ah.
So if you think about that, it's a pretty finite resource and we need to look after it.
We do.
And we can do things like, you know, it's a lot of people want to plant trees, restoring natural habitats. And that's partly about absorbing some of that carbon.
Yeah.
And also about, because also you get all sorts of knock-on effects. Mm-hmm. Like we're standing in a woodland here, it'll naturally moderate the temperature locally because it's shady here. So if you come here in the summer, it's not as hot as it is outside. So if you've got trees around your houses, hopefully you don't need to use air conditioning quite so much because it's cooler.
Yep.
All this vegetation here bonds the soil together. So if it rains, all this soil doesn't get washed down into the river and silt the rivers up. If you're looking at a grassland area with loads of plants in it, loads of different flowering plants, that can produce natural pollinators.
Yep.
So if we think about grasslands, I mean, where, you know, if you improve the amount of flowering plants in there, that's a natural resource for all the pollinators. We know how much we rely on pollinators.
Yep.
I can't remember what percentage of food is actually pollinated, but it's quite important things like tomatoes and apples, and you know, there's a huge amount of our food which wouldn't be produced if we didn't have insect pollinators.
Yep.
And there are some areas in the United States, for example, where, you know, they've done these massive plain areas which used to be flower rich and they're now big open fields, and they have to bring in lorry loads of bees to actually pollinate their crops because they just don't have the pollinators in those fields.
So one thing that's really in the news at the moment, it's all about tree planting, isn't it? But it's not actually the best solution, is it?
I think the way to think about it is the right trees in the right place. Because yes, you can increase the carbon sequestration in an area. So you've got a field or a farmland area, and if you plant trees on it, it will take more carbon in. Now, we talked about sequestration. You need to explain what that means.
Yeah.
So we talked about the process of the plant when they photosynthesize. The sun's rays, they use that energy to take the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and put the carbon into the trunk of the tree, the roots and everything else, and give out oxygen.
And that's called a carbon store, isn't it? They're
it's a carbon store.
Carbon.
So it's stored in the trunks or in the leaves of the plants on the ground, in the grasses, in their roots, partly in the deadwood, but also in a naturally functioning system, it will pump it into the soil. So those are carbon stores. And sequestration means, it's derived from a Greek word, I think, but it means to hide away.
Right.
So I could, you know, if I wanted to, I can't afford it, I have to say, but I could buy a cottage on the Welsh coast and sequester myself.
Okay.
I could go in there and hide it away,
Yeah.
hide myself away. And that's what that means, sequestering. But trees can do that. But then, for example, if you've got a football pitch, you can't no longer use that as a football pitch afterwards.
Yeah.
Or more importantly, farmland. Well, clearly you can plant trees all over the farmland. But where are you going to grow your food?
Exactly.
But there are also improvements you can make to grassland itself. So taking a grassland, it's really weird, we call it improved grassland. That means it's improved...
By leaving it alone?
No, by adding loads of things to try and get more grass off it to feed the animals. But it generally means that it's a lot less abundant wildlife in there.
Yes.
I mean...
So it's improved for the feed quality, but not for our pollinators and the things that we actually want it for.
Yeah, and there's also evidence it's actually not improved the feed quality. There's more and more evidence. I mean, people talk about pasture-fed rather than just grass-fed. And there's a lot more evidence that if you've got a horse grazing on a really rich field with loads of flowers on it and they're eating bits of pollen and different types of plant, they get far more nutrients and goodness from that rather than... just basic grass. Yeah. And I suppose you can almost vision it like, if you're having a pudding, you could just eat loads of suet and that could be a pudding. Or if you've got loads of fruit in amongst it and loads of good stuff and less of the pudding, that's better for you.
Yep.
You'll still survive on it, but you won't be as healthy.
And it won't be as nice.
No, and that's it. But as I say, there are improvements. If you take what I was talking about as an improved grassland and put flowering plants back in it, that can sequester more carbon and take in more carbon. So it's trees in the right place, but it's also decisions about adding trees to a hedgerow.
Yeah.
Can be good. Maintaining a hedgerow, because that can sequester carbon as well. So I say it's quite complicated and there's a lot of figures in my head which I won't start spouting.
No, please don't. Not on the podcast. It is a huge subject, and this is just a little intro into it. And we're looking at it from a very landscape scale. We're looking at the big picture and we're looking at the whole of Hampshire, and what we can do to make our land holdings better. But what can people do?
Well, you can actually, there are little tiny things, because, it's like people's gardens are like a massive nature reserve when you're all together, and even with pollinators. Bug Life, I think, at one point was suggesting just get a square metre of your lawn and let it grow.
Yep.
And you see what wildflowers come up in it, which can support your pollinators. And then if you add all those up across all the gardens across England and the UK, that's quite a big thing to do. It's
a huge area. There's more gardens than there are national nature reserves in area-wise in the UK.
And one of the main principles as well is the fact that there's this principle called bigger, better, more joined up. So your special places, your sites of special scientific interest. So we're in an ancient woodland here.
Yeah.
It's a special place. We need to manage it better. So maybe, if some of these trees fall over, you don't just tidy them up.
No,
we
just
use
leave
them
them.
Firewood. Because when you burn firewood's are good. It's better than a fossil fuel, which is those buried fuels like oil and coal, and peat as well. But it's not, but there is a carbon store in that log line there, which will slowly release, but it's not being released instantly. So, but also make them slightly bigger. So we're thinking of doing a bit of planting around the edge to make the woodland a bit bigger. And the more joined up as well.
Yeah.
Because the better joined up it is, the better the species in them are able to move across the landscape. And you might have a block of chalk grassland, which is really rich for pollinators, and it's 2 kilometres away or even more away to the next bit. So the insects can't move across.
Yeah.
But if we do a couple of fringes of fields that are flower rich, or maybe restore a bit of chalk grassland in between.
Yeah.
So it could be a corridor, as we call them, or a stepping stone. So a bee can go from that bit to that bit to that bit and move around more naturally. Because one of the main principles is also all these functions that things do, I've talked about, are quite often called nature-based solutions. Because there are some people, when we're looking at carbon in the atmosphere, of thinking about technical ways. of trying to get the carbon out, or even burying it once you've got it in a tree. You know? And so there are actual things where you've got like a tank with this metal thing comes out of the tank and captures the carbon, and it goes back, drops back into the tank, and it's absorbed into the chemicals in the tank, and it's an artificial tree.
We don't really need them though, do we? Because we've got trees.
We've got trees, yeah. And nature-based solutions are practical, and they've evolved to do that over millions of years. And they're cheap. And it's not the only reason doing it, but they're cheap and effective, and they quite often do it 24/7.
Yeah.
And we don't need to have produced all this steel and electricity and chemicals, because that tree's doing the same job. Because I also talked about flooding becoming more and more of a problem. I mean, clearly we've seen it on the news where, the Severn recently was flooded and had to evacuate loads of people, and some people have been dying. I think it was in Australia just the last week, about 12 people died in floods out there. And that's partly because we've altered the landscape so much that all the water washes off. We drain places and try and think, well, we can make this paddock better by having less water in it. So we try and get the water off as quick as possible. So then the water gets in stream, downstream, and it builds up more than it should down there. And then they try and get the water off until it ends up in somebody's living room, full of silt. But actually, if you've got more woodlands in the upland areas and vegetation which bind the soils, it acts like a sponge, and it's held back up there and slowly released. So that's what we call natural flood management.
So a lot of these terms you've used today, like sequestration, it's going to become a lot more common when we're talking about these nature-based solutions, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's people say it's unusual that I don't have any sort of meeting where I don't mention beavers.
I was waiting for that to come up, Andy.
Because beavers are what we call a keystone species, and their impact is far greater than just what they do. Now, European beavers, I'll say that again. Now, European beavers used to be in Britain, but they were hunted for their fur and for their anal glands, something in their anal glands, castroides I think they call it, which was used in all sorts of medicine and stuff like that. And you can eat them as well.
You can eat them, you can use their fur. They are a very versatile animal.
But they were hunted to extinction. Probably about 1500, 1600. So it's not relatively that long ago. But they've been reintroduced into pens over here, and actually in Scotland there's some wild beavers, and at the moment they are looking in England at some licenses to release them just into the wild, not into pens. Now what they do is, everybody knows what beavers do.
They make a big dam.
They make big dams and flood places, and actually, trouble is people live in Narnia, and of course the beavers there eat fish. They don't eat fish, but they create what they're trying to do for themselves, because they eat the bark and the leaves off the trees. And they make these ponds in wooded areas. Generally, they will eat grass and stuff. They will graze like some animals will, but they'll cut down the trees and small bushes, and then store that in the water through the winter, and it gives them a food supply. So they create this pond basically, and it's clearly good for things that are like ponds. Your frogs, dragonflies, loads of insects, breeding fish, birds then come and feed on all that stuff. But also it will increase the amount of carbon that little bit of woodland can sequester, because ponds are very good at that. Plus also it holds back the water. So it doesn't come rushing down the channels and flood downstream. It holds it back. I've seen one study, I think, where it took, before beavers got into a system, from the top of the bottom of the valley, it used to take about 2 hours for the water to get down the valley. Well, with beaver dams upstream, it was taking several days. So it's a slow release of water. So you don't get those floods flushing down through.
And taking all of the substrate and everything else with it.
All the silt and all the pollution. Ponds are very good at filtering out any pollutions as well, so they're good for that. Now in Germany, in Bavaria, where they've had beavers reintroduced for 50 years or more, there was a study done where this town needed flood defences. It doesn't stop them happening straight away, you still need flood defences, but they planned €1 million to put the flood defences in for this one town. It just so happened beavers moved in upstream just before they built it all. And they didn't need such big flood defences, and they saved €600,000.
That's pretty good.
And of course, these beavers are up there, beavering away, all the time. It's not sending some bloke out up with a shovel to adjust things, you know. Clearly, they do chop down trees, and people worry about, well, it's my favourite tree in the garden, but there are things you can do with that. And actually, my paddock's a bit wetter, but there are things you can do to control them, or just maybe don't worry about that little wet bit. But the benefits far outweigh any problems. And I think it's quite likely there are going to be beavers released across the country in the next few years. And it's one of those nature-based solutions I talked about. And we need ways of coping with that, because I don't want my favourite apple tree chopped down. I don't think they're going to get there. It's quite dry way out.
Yeah, not where you are.
No. But we need ways of coping with them and living with them.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Andy. It's been really good to hear about the very huge topic of nature recovery, and I can't wait to see beavers in Hampshire.
Yeah, I mean, they're going to be lovely. I mean, it's quite often, because there was beavers on the River Otter, strangely, in Devon, and people just suddenly, I mean, I think the locals knew they were there for some time, and then, because if you're going to release them, you need to do it licensed way. So they first off checked they were European beavers, but the locals really fought for them to stay, because people were visiting the area just to see beavers.
Well, yeah.
They were their beavers. You can't take our beavers away, and they've got the right to stay now. So it's I think it's a very exciting time. It may need some changes for all of us, including how we manage conservation land.
Definitely.
But you're going to be seeing more and more of this information coming up, and I think everybody needs to understand it, and it helps people if people understand it, so we can get local support when we try and change things.
And where can people go to find out more information?
Yeah, it's a very new topic, and if you probably looked at it, you wouldn't even find much on the internet these days. But we are going to produce a special series of podcasts to look at various bits of this. So keep your ears open for those, and you'll hear me talking about this far more.
Well, I hope you have all enjoyed this episode of Looking After Nature. We'd love to hear from you with any comments or thoughts, or if there's another topic you'd like us to discuss, let us know by checking out our social media pages.
And as always, please rate us on iTunes so it helps other people find our stuff. Once again, I'm Andy Davidson.
And I'm Carly Harrod. See you next time.